Have you ever heard of? You must have heard of Ahmed Shawqi. Ahmed Shawqi is known as the Prince of Poetry in Egypt. Right? He's a very famous Arab poet in the early part of the 20th century. Shawqi wrote verse praising Mustafa Kemal. Praising Mustafa Kemal because he saw him as a great military leader who defeated the British at Gallipoli, who defeated the Greeks in the war against Greece, right? When Mustafa Kemal abolished the Khilafah, Shawqi was shocked. He was like, he was in trauma. He's written a verse which is one of the most famous eulogies to the Khilafah. Very moving. People who read it, they're in tears reading this. Okay. When he wrote it, Mustafa Sabri, the same last mufti of the Khilafah, said, now you're mourning it. Now you criticize Mustafa Kemal. But some of us could see this coming from before. Some of us could see the trajectory that the Young Turks and the nationalists and the secularists were going on. Others saw them as a means to an end. They thought, you know what, these guys are trying to regain some prestige and power to the Khilafah. Many pro-Islamic, pro-Caliphate people thought even the Young Turks were doing something good, or Mustafa Kemal was doing something good, until they saw the final knife being stabbed in, and then they realized the magnitude of what had happened in retrospect. And Muslims can be very trusting and make excuses for people when perhaps they ought to be looking at much more scrutiny.
Assalamu alaikum legends. 100 Hijri years ago this week, in 1342, something calamitous befell the ummah. It was the official abolishment of the last caliphate. We have today, in this special Islam 20 Unscripted episode, someone who is very dear to me, a beloved brother, and I consider him an elder brother and mentor of mine, Dr. Abdul Wahid from Hizb ut-Tahrir Britain. He's the UK chairman, mashallah. We talk about the history of a bit of the history of the Khilafah, what Khilafah really means to him, and obviously, of course, some of the juicy stuff. What would it look like today? How can we establish serious and effective Muslim unity globally once again? Just before we get into it, just a quick reminder, please do subscribe if you're into this kind of stuff, so you get at the front of the queue whenever we publish something new. Give us a like or a comment, get involved in the conversation, and click this banner up here to help support Islam 20 Unscripted. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Abdul Wahid.
Wa alaikum assalam, Dr. Salman Butt.
How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, all well. I mean, we obviously, this topic is an important one, and we thought we can't talk about this, topic, the Khilafah, without inviting someone with a deep kind of a special interest and a background in this topic. So it would be and Jazakallah khair for pointing our attention towards this topic. I had no idea that in my head the abolition of the Khilafah, the popular year is 1924.
24, that's right.
Which is, the Centennial is going to be in 3 years, but Hijri date, I never knew this until we spoke. So 1342.
That's right.
What some historians call the official abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate.
Yeah.
So the Khilafah is often described as a system set off by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like a succession of different kind of heads or figureheads of the ummah in terms of the actual leader, and we've been through many throughout our history. But before we get into the kind of the meat and potatoes, I just wanted to ask you, what does Khilafah mean to you?
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. As-salatu was-salamu ala Rasulillah. So Khilafah means to me the political leadership of the Muslim ummah. The Khalifa was otherwise called the Imam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, and the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the hadith which mentions this, mentioned in Sahih Muslim, narrated by Abu Hurairah radiyallahu an, that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Kanat Banu Israel tasusuhumul anbiya." That the children of Israel, they used to be governed by their prophets. كلما هلك نبي خلفه نبي. Whenever one died, there would be another prophet that succeeded him. وإنه لا نبي بعدي. And there will be no prophet after me. Very famous line from the Sunnah, yes. ستكون خلفاء. But there will be khulafa, khalifas. And fatakthur, and there will be many. And the Sahaba asked him, so what do you order us in relation to these? He said, fu bi bay'ati awwali fil awwal. He said, fulfill your bay'ah to them, your pledge to them. So they took a pledge to rule according to Kitab and Sunnah, according to Islam, from Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu an to the succeeding Khalifa. This was the condition, that they will rule according to Islam. And of course we know that many of the Ahkam Sharia, actually the method of their implementation really, or securing their implementation is through the Khilafah. So whether it's the establishment of the prayer, especially the Jummah prayer, the collection of the Zakat, the looking after the affairs of people in terms of providing health, food, shelter, clothing, education, spreading Islam to the world, being the voice for Islam on the world stage. And in particular, you know, you look at the even right till the tail end of the Ottoman Khilafah, this was a role that the Khalifas of that Khilafah were actually playing, a voice for Islam in the world. And so 100 years without an Amir for the Mu'mineen, without an Imam of the Muslims, without this Sharia role being fulfilled is a huge problem for us.
Yeah. Were there any times historically where we were in a similar position?
No, not like this. I mean, there have been periods of conflict where
the Muslims aren't united under one Khalifa, one leader.
Okay, so yeah, there have been, but not like this. So we know that after the time of Banu Umayyah and the succession of Banu Abbas, that there was a remnant of the Umayyad dynasty, if you like, in Andalus, which didn't, and there have been other places like that which didn't, if you like, they set themselves up as their own sultanates or emirates and things like that, but not in the way that happened in the last 100 years, where we've default gone to not just divided, but ruling by other than Islam.
And dozens of them, and drawn by the colonial powers for the most part. There's no precedent in history, and those other historical aberrants, and there were aberrations that can't be used to justify the state we're in today. Although some people do actually, but that's the way it goes, really. Yeah, I mean, I know this is going to be very hard for you, but try and imagine I'm a complete ignoramus.
Yeah.
So, historically speaking, some people think, Khilafah, or what you're describing, is like some kind of bloody dictatorship, and there's, obviously you can find examples with, what's it called, fratricide or something.
Yeah.
People killing their brothers to get power and rival dynasties and all that kind of stuff. So how would you describe how a Khilafah, in terms of the model that's been adopted historically, how it's different to what some people might imagine, or what projections some maybe enemies of Islam might give of this is some kind of bloody dictatorship?
It's a good question, and I think objectively one can't describe 1300 years of Khilafah as being without problems, without flaws, without a corrupt people, without conflict. That this would not be true. Khilafah, but it could still be Khilafah, right? It could still be Khilafah. It could still fulfill the conditions of the Sharia of Khilafah. The Khilafah that we know is the Khilafah that is the gold standard that we aspire to look at and learn from, is the Khilafah Rashida. And
the first
five actually is
Khulafa.
the first five Khulafa, and then obviously people look at the examples in Islamic history of other Khulafa who were very just and could be described with that title, and Umar bin Abdul Aziz, may Allah have mercy on him, is usually almost universally acknowledged as being one of the righteously guided Khulafa. There were many problems appeared, conflicts, and one of the problems is the corruption of this bay'ah process, if you like. The first five Khulafa were given the pledge freely, in slightly different ways actually, but given the pledge free when they represented having the backing of the authority of the Ahlul Hal wal Aqd. And as dynastic rule started, that bay'ah process gets corrupted. And with that corruption of a bay'ah process, you get all kinds of games where people are trying to keep a political dynasty within their succession. And the Khalifa should only come out of a small number of families or clans within a family. And this is kind of the thing that wrongly justified the idea that you could kill somebody else. And so those things happen. But Salman, those Orientalist kind of magnifications of the problems of Khilafah, they pale into significance when you look at, say, the equivalent 1300 years of the history of Europe, which was, ruled under
Dark Ages.
the authority of the oppressive authority of the Catholic Church, the Spanish Inquisition, war, conflict between states. There's no
Divine
comparison.
right of kings.
There's no comparison. And more than that, you said in your trailer for this, look at the last 100 years, talking about bloodshed. How much bloodshed in Al-Nakba? How much bloodshed in the war in Algeria? Estimates of like 1.5 million people killed by that. How much bloodshed in two Gulf wars, 91 and 2003? How much bloodshed in the Iraq war?
And that's just the Muslims.
And that's just the Muslim. But in more recent times, Syria, Yemen, Libya, these conflicts can be traced to problems that existed from the demise of the Khilafah in 1924, 1342. And that's just the Muslims. And so when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَعْدَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ, the disbelievers, they're allies of one another. إِلَّا تَفْعَلُوا تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَفَسَادٌ كَبِيرٌ. If you don't, Muslims, if you don't do the same, if you don't unite as awliya of each other, then there will be a fitna on this earth and great fasad, great corruption. And that's on the earth, Allah says, not just for you Muslims. This is for humanity. And that's the state we're in. What happened in 1924, 1342, was a destabilization of the Middle East and the Muslim world, which the world is not recovering from, to be honest with you. It's still in that state of instability from what was created at that time. And obviously what happened then was the end of a series of problems, but it wasn't an event in itself. It was the culmination of other problems, basically.
I do want to get into the question of, what happened, because that, the thing with history is you can go down a rabbit hole and look at one thing, and a lot of people have different kind of theories about where it went wrong, so to speak. And I do want to get into that, but just for rewind back a few seconds, you mentioned this phrase Ahlul Hali wal Aqd. Well, how do you describe this group? This is the group who appoints the leader? So
they are, if you like, the people who represent the authority of the people of the ummah, if you like. So in the time of the Sahaba in the Khilafah Rashida, they were the senior Sahaba who carried the respect of
the leaders of the tribe.
The leaders, they could be the leaders of the tribe. They exist in, if you like, in reality. In every society, you have the establishment or the aristocracy or the ones who carry the most respect. Okay, now in different societies that might manifest in different ways. So in a very tribal society, it would definitely be the leaders of tribes. In other societies, it might not be represented that way. It's entirely possible. In fact, in our vision of Khilafah in the future, to realize that in a real way, you'd probably have elections to elect representatives from the ummah. Yeah.
Did you just say elections?
Yes, absolutely. Because in fact, and you can draw that from the example of the first four Khulafa, right?
Yeah. I do want to get into the discussion of what would, if we're imagining kind of practically,
Sure.
what would a Khilafah
But
look like
just to
in the future?
explain that concept of ahlul hal wal aqd, that actually, if you imagine, if you had a free election and you had Majlis al-Ummah, which was a representative body, then those people actually would carry legitimate representation of people. So if those people ended up electing a ruler for the Muslims, that would carry the due authority. Yeah. But similarly, if you had a more tribal society, that could be manifest through the leaders of tribes, because in that society they would be representative of that.
I like to kind of think about, separate between the maybe just historic kind of things that happen because of historical circumstance and the actual normative stuff. The things that we want to focus on, saying this is intended by Allah in and of itself. So, for example, the notion of khulafa and a khalifa and a leader, to me, is built up on so many evidences, and from the perspective of, pragmatically, from the perspective of, the Prophet ﷺ said, you need to have someone who is, appoint a leader, even if it's just three of you traveling somewhere, appoint a leader, right? Because pragmatically, you need someone who can represent the group. You need someone who can make certain decisions, who can judge between disputes, who can be that final call, for example, when there's consultation, who can negotiate on your behalf, right? And the bigger the group, the more people you have to, they need. It's going to be harder to survey each and every.
The more important the issue, the more important. So if you have to have a leader when three of you are traveling, a more important issue than that, you need to have a leader for.
So if there's 10,000 of you, and you need to say, even in a local area, for example, you need to talk about, planning permission or whatever, right? Or who do we make a trade deal with, or who do we go to war with, or whatever. It's impossible practically to survey everyone, but you have to have.
Why?
It's impossible to survey every single person if there's thousands and thousands of you, because you can't do that. There has to be some kind of representative you can go to negotiate that deal with, and that representative can't just be some puppet, because they're not going to be. Eventually, if the representative isn't echoing the will of the masses, they're going to get overthrown, or there's going to be some kind of resentment. It's not. You're not going to see a stable kind of civil society for a long period of time, like we've seen in the Muslim world, for 1,000+ years, stability. And I think that's because the power has been. There's a weird paradox though between the guy at the top being distant from to some extent distant from the daily kind of workings and the decision making of the average person, but at the same time he's a representative, and they feel that even kind of spiritual or ceremonial kind of connection, that at least look for the big decisions, for the macro level decisions, who do we go to war with, who do we make treaties with, etc., etc. We've got someone looking at the maslahah of the whole ummah, or a large amount of them. But on an actual practical day-to-day business level, it seems historically, and I'm no historian, but the majority of the ummah was just so it had their own independent kind of governors, little city-states or tribal areas or whatever, but they had that ceremonial figure that they paid homage to. And the thing is, the bigger you get, the harder it is to intervene and control people's direct kind of affairs and government. So the Prophet ﷺ, he kind of spearheaded this, it seems. I mean, we were just talking about Sheikh Abdul Haq Bewley's article that you mashallah, you sent over. Amazing, really opened my eyes in terms of the detail with which the Prophet ﷺ did things and governed certain things, right? That he had certain people, scribes, to take down certain treaties, and scribes to do this and that, and people appointed to collect zakat and jizya, and people appointed to judge people's disputes, etc., etc. So he had all the kind of the trappings that what we understand now of a modern kind of government. I don't want to say state because that has its own kind of, but you get what I mean, right? And one of those things was he sent governors, and he pioneered
appointed governors. Yes.
He pioneered this thing of regional kind of governance and stuff, and it's impossible practically for him to sallallahu alaihi wasallam directly communicate. So there would be such a degree for the majority of our history, a degree of autonomy. Things only get escalated to the Khalifa if maybe people are upset with the governor, they want to overthrow him or whatever. So that's a kind of, so there's that, it seems that like a kind of pragmatic system where in order for life to just exist, for societies to be safe and successful and prosperous, you do need to have someone, not one person, but you need to have people representing other people, and the further up you go, the bigger the size of that polity, the less kind of interference is in everyone's daily lives.
So there needs to be, some of this needs to be crystallized. The danger of calling it it's a pragmatic system could imply that anything will do as long as it meets the ends, and that isn't necessarily true. And certainly it isn't necessarily the sunnah, if you like, right? So you've pointed out some really important things. What is the sunnah in ruling, right? So the Khalifa is the Khalifa. He is the leader. He's the Amir of the Mu'mineen. And over 13 centuries, the Amir could be like Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab, who was the second Khalifa of the Muslims, who ruled over a vast area geographically in those days, without telephones and Zoom calls and airplanes and fast road connections and text messages and stuff like that, right? So, and he is undisputedly the Amir of the Mu'mineen, right? There's no ambiguity that he's ceremonial or anything like that. So, the Khalifa is the Amir. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also, as you rightly say, didn't even attempt to govern the affairs of the Muslims on his own. He had assistants. Abu Bakr and Umar, may Allah be pleased with them both. He referred to them as his ministers, wazirain. He said he has two in the earth and two in the heavens, meaning the angels. So, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he had people to assist him with the day-to-day running. So Abu Bakr and Umar, may Allah be pleased with them, used to solve problems and then come back and consult with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He used to appoint governors, right? But he would appoint them. They weren't kind of in his day. They weren't like elected. But there was a very interesting relationship. He would appoint governors. But actually, if people complained about those governors, he would actually remove them. So he understood, really, he showed us the concept of authority has to be a trusting relationship between the ruler and the ruled. Okay?
And that's what bay'ah is in its essence. It's from the root ba, waw, ayn, ba, ya, ayn.
But bay'ah is not given to the wali. Bay'ah is given to the Khalifa. And the Khalifa appoints the wali. So the wali is, if you like, delegated by the Khalifa to do the job. And actually the wali could be ruling by Sharia. He could be ruling justly, right? But he could have lost the trust of the people for other reasons. And then there's an example when a tribe, I think they were the tribe called Abdul Qais, they were called. They came to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and they complained to him about their wali. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam removed that wali and appointed a new one. And just gave the wali the advice: look after them, like treat the respected people from Abdul Qais properly. Otherwise, He didn't say this in the narration, but the implication being, otherwise you don't have those trust of those leaders. They're going to come back to me and I'm going to have to appoint another one, basically, yes? So what you're saying is right in the sense that the Sunnah example shows that the Amir doesn't rule by himself. So in the modern world, where we have a Muslim majority world stretching from Indonesia in the Far East to Morocco in the West, with the great technology that we have that ties people together much more easily, you'd still have to practically, whoever is the Khalifa in Jerusalem, inshallah, in Beit al-Maqdis, will still appoint walis.
Or in Harrow.
No, this is based on hadith, you know, that the future capital of Khilafah will be in Beit al-Maqdis. So, inshallah, so we pray we see that. So in this respect, you're right. You're also right, but this really is not, I mean, this is a different question, that there's always the risk that the ruler or the Amir in any given situation, the head teacher in a school, can become distanced from the grassroots. That's a reality that can happen, right? It didn't happen with Sayyidina Umar. And he made sure that didn't happen. He was walking the streets at night to know what's happening on the ground, if you like. So these are examples from the Khulafa Rashidun that we have to learn from, because we, meaning the Muslims in future.
What do you think of the discussion so far, folks? Interesting. Let us know in the comments what you think. There's so many lessons about leadership, just generally, that we learn from the Prophet ﷺ, from the first, rightly guided caliphs, and it's a big kind of shock to the system if somebody is just absorbed a particular notion of, because we sitting here in the UK, where we've absorbed so much baggage from Roman Judeo-Christian kind of tradition of what a leader is, what a ruler is, went from the emperor to the divine right of kings to God's kind of representative on earth in terms of whatever I say goes. This is what God wants, whatever the Pope or the king or whatever. This is a very different model to that.
And this baggage is something that affects us all around the world, isn't it? If you travel to Muslim majority countries, people in their lifetimes, they've only ever known one way of governance. Which
Iron fist.
Well, but actually, okay, they've only ever known one model of governance to look up to, right? Which is the Western democratic model, like we saw in Washington in January, where a guy with a moose's outfit goes into. I mean, I'm ridiculing that because it does show you
khuruj against the ruler.
And we live in the UK where we see it close up all its flaws. Really, we see how a working democracy works. When you go, one of the beautiful things about that article and any other article, really authentic article about Islamic politics, the example of the Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam as a ruler, is that look back to your own tradition, not so that you go back to riding on camels and in the dust and this kind of nonsense that look back to the example and think authentically what comes from that. Think of your own lessons and principles that come from that. Don't try and make that fit onto what you've been colonized into thinking is the right way of ruling. That's one of the very nice things about that article. And I just would clarify one thing, which I'm sure what you said is correct about there needing to be an Amir, because actually you can't function without an Amir. But the hadith I mentioned before and other ahadith as well.
I mean, there's some things Islamically
the hadith I mentioned before and the other hadith, they actually specify the fact that there needs to be a ruler for the Muslims, right? That there needs to be one ruler. An imam, one, and very strong sanction for the Muslims if they start dividing under.
I mean, there are certain things which are ta'abudiyya, right? That are related to the means which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended in particular.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, for example, that you need someone to give, salah, for example, right? even on a local level, but even on someone who is leading the Muslims in Hajj.
Yes.
Someone who is the representative who has Islamically a normative kind of status from the text of the Quran and Sunnah, from the understanding of the scholars, that this person has a religious, I don't like the word anyway, but ta'abbudi function to do with worship, to do with actual things that are not based on, not contingent on time and place and norms and so forth.
So
but there's the other angle as well. All right?
These things, like you say, Hajj. I mean, Hajj. The Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to appoint somebody as the Amir of Hajj, and the Khilafah used to appoint somebody as the Amir of Hajj. From they were the ones who appointed it. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was ordered by Allah to take the sadaqah, take the zakat. خُذْ بِأَمْوَالِهِمْ. Yes, Allah says in Surah At-Tawbah. And the Khulafa used to take the zakat and make sure it's distributed according to the Quranic categories. I mentioned this to you in a discussion beforehand, that one of the Turkish nationalists who voted against the abolition of Khilafah did so on the grounds that the Muslims would be up in arms. He said they will not think their Jummah prayer is valid, because certainly amongst the Hanafi ulama who were dominant in the Ottoman state, the Jummah prayer was contingent on there being a Khalifa to be valid. They never said subsequently, don't pray your Jummah. We all pray our Jummah, but what they did say was, you should pray your Dhuhr as well, your 4 rakat fard for Dhuhr as well, because that Jummah may not suffice for you, right? And so,
even outside the Hanafi tradition, there are some scholars who, up until this day, they would pray Dhuhr after they did the Jummah khutbah, after they prayed Jummah and they prayed Dhuhr as well. So there is that ta'abbudi kind of element certainly there. But in terms of, because you understand, obviously, that riding camels is different to, leading prayer.
Yeah.
But the issue is, where do you draw in that line? And that line is drawn, by definition, it's going to be an ijtihadi issue. Some people say it's here, some people say it's there. And I think understanding that difference, or how to deal with that different groups, different organizations, different schools of thought, different scholars and so forth, we need to recognize that. And I think this is part of the, how can we regain some kind of unity, or how did the disunity happen? A very key part of that is Muslims on a local and a national, international, whatever level, not knowing or not properly dealing with their variety, their differences, inflating small differences into huge ones, making huge ones negligent. I think that is a key.
So if you're saying
area.
that some people think that we must have a Khalifa for the Muslims, but really predominantly that Khalifa should be there just because our Jummah should be valid, and just so that he can appoint an Amir of Hajj, and just so that we fulfill this prophetic command to give bay'ah to a Khalifa and we don't die sinful because of that. Like, if you like, the last Ottoman Khalifa, Sultan Abdul Majid II, who was reduced to a figurehead ruler. I would say, if somebody's calling for that, I would say, why would you call for that? Because when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned fu fi bayati al-awwali fil awwal, fulfill the bay'ah, he preceded that by talking about Banu Israel used to be ruled and governed by their prophets. Or in another hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned to us about our own responsibility, right, in doing things. And he talked about the Imam. He said, Muhammad, ألا كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته فالإمام الذي إمام الذي على الناس راء. The imam over the rules over the people is a guardian, and he'll be asked about what is his responsibility.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. On every stage,
every
that's
stage.
the thing.
And
the man over his house
yes,
is the imam of the house.
إنما الإمام جنة. The imam is a shield. يقاتل من ورائه ويتقى به. You fight behind him and you protect yourself by him. Okay? And many, many, many more examples like this where it's explicit that this ruler had the function to look after people, whether it's their life, their security, their wealth and poverty, their education and health. This fell on not just the spiritual things. So Abdul Hamid al-Thani, may Allah have mercy on him, arguably the last Khalifa who exercised that authority to do that and tried to do that to the best of his ability. So I understand what you're saying, that some people will say, okay, we need to have a Khalifa, but if you get into the nitty-gritty of looking after people's affairs and running roads and hospitals and stuff, then what is there for, is that really what we want? And the answer to that is yes, according to the Sunnah, that is what you want. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, you could say that...
But it's about the how and the why.
Okay.
Right?
So that's a different matter. But we're clear that ruling Khilafah is not just a spiritual thing like Abdul Majid II, may Allah have mercy on him, was. Yeah.
But so it depends what you mean, right? So the Khalifa as a figurehead, as a person, he has some things which are to Abudiyah, they have some functions which they have to be carried out by a single person, right? Or delegate. He can delegate to an XYZ person. But some of the functions are matters of means to an end. Right?
Zakat.
Yeah.
Does this fall under your definition of
It
ta'budiyah?
It depends.
Zakat.
Again, even zakat.
Zakat
it's a broad thing.
Okay.
Zakat of, every hukum has different things attached to it, different manat, right? So zakat in terms of zakat in and of itself as a pillar, zakat in terms of the details of collection, who's collecting it, from whom is it collected, who is it distributed to, and so
ultimately,
forth.
Who is responsible for that?
We all are.
No.
Right.
Ultimately, who? Okay.
So that's the thing.
So
who's responsible for giving it, or who's responsible for it not being given if it was?
Within the Sharia, there are things which are left to me where I am accountable to Allah for, and there are things as a collective where we have an Amir who is responsible for that. That is the method by which it is taken. So when the tribes refused to pay the zakat after the passing of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yes, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh didn't say that's between them and Allah, because that would have meant he was failing in his duty as the Amir of the Mu'mineen.
I'm talking about the how. So electronically taking it from your bank account or using an app or that kind of stuff.
Those are all
That's
legitimate. Those are all legitimate ways of doing it. But if somebody didn't do it, then it's the political authority that is responsible for. So
but who's responsible if that political authority is failing?
Then we
That's
all
what I'm
are.
saying.
We all are. We all are. Then yes.
Yes. So the thing is, I love going into these details just to test where the line is for different people and what they're thinking and stuff. Yeah. But I think the moral of the story is, you and another person might have 10 ideas amongst ourselves about where exactly the line is, right?
But could be.
When it comes to, that's the thing between, and I think this, I'm belabouring this point because I think it's very crucial to the moving forward of the ummah, and I think it's many people think it's one of the many reasons for the downfall of the Khilafah itself, right? Of us not recognizing or not treating differences where they need to belong. So there's when any hukum, any agreement two people have or disagreement they have, it could be on two levels. You can split it up, right? One is the actual, they call it al-ijtihad al-ta'siliya, ta'sili. The actual what is the theoretical hukum? How much is zakah, for example? And the second level of disagreement can occur on, okay, how do we implement that into this particular country or society or whatever? I don't want to use zakah because that's anything, and halal meat, for example.
So if we're talking about the difference between a collector of zakat going out and going to village by village and collecting it, right, versus electronically, right? This is about the means by which you're doing it, all right? But
not the means. No. Okay, I'm talking about implementing anything you have theoretically.
The point I'm making is that on the issue of zakat, just as an example, right? It's the Sharia that says, and the examples from the Sharia that reinforce this, that from the history of ruling, that reinforce this, that ultimately Khalifa needs to be there. The political authority is there to make sure it's done. That's the method the Sharia gave for that.
But the thing is, that's what I'm trying to differentiate. So, because a lot of our discourse, especially in the Dawah domain and activism, is primarily focused on that first region. What's the theoretically, what is the truth? Here's the truth. I can write it down in 100 lines or whatever. You know, this is the ruling on that, this is the ruling on that. And differences that occur there, they are somewhat serious. If you depending on how fundamental that thing is and the consequences. But there's a whole level of how do you implement that in real life?
Let's take these few essential things from the Sharia, and how do you implement that?
How do you concretize it in real life?
Absolutely, and that's going to be very. That's going to be something which is open to discussion, open to debate, open to thought, because the differences in different parts of the world might make the reality different on how you do that, and that could be in a future Khilafah or in a past Khilafah, done centrally or done locally. It could be that you have the wula, the governors.
And I'm not talking about Khilafah. I'm just talking about anything generally in terms of Muslims getting along and practically just surviving and thriving and flourishing as societies. So, in terms of if you and I disagree, for example, on whether a piece of chicken is halal, right? So, that's about that piece of chicken.
It's about an objective study. Yes,
it's filtering through our own cognitive.
But if we all decide, let's go out and eat a halal meal, we might have a difference of what kind of meal we're going to eat.
And do we have that? I think what we need to focus on is that maturity to recognize that you and I can sit on the same table. You're eating something which, in my opinion, is haram, but in your opinion is halal. Now, somebody who's primarily focused on just the theory, they'll be like, oh, haram, halal, halal, haram. How can you be eating haram? But we're recognizing, no. We're not talking about, I am eating haram, full stop. No. I have to judge you according to what you understand that piece of meat to be, for example. Yeah. And that's the thing. That's the thing I think we need to focus on. And the thing which we're losing, I think, sometimes.
That definitely, when you and I meet each other sometimes, and we meet with other people, we don't always share the same views, right? We don't always share the same opinions. You and I have been to places where people pray, and some will combine their Dhuhr and Asr because they're travellers, and others will not. And these kind of things. And I don't think that guy's Asr is batil because he combined it. He prayed in the Dhuhr time. I don't think like that. You don't think like that, But
some people do.
Some people do, and that is a failure to understand the context of legitimate ikhtilaf in fiqh, right? And some people also cross over a boundary of what's legitimate ijtihad in fiqh, and they think anything goes based on their intention, right? So we started this part of this conversation with whether the Khalifa should be just a spiritual figurehead or practically a political ruler. It's really hard to justify the spiritual figurehead through a legitimate ijtihad.
Normally the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Sure, but the truth may be somewhere in the middle, but the point is it's very hard to justify the Khalifa as a spiritual figurehead from any objective reading of the texts.
I don't think anyone, I haven't never come across anyone who's saying that. That's a kind of extreme you know,
Well, that was a debate. That was a debate post the abolition of the Khilafah, when there were some debates in the Muslim world, in Egypt, in the Middle East, about appointing a new Khalifa. The point was that he should just be the figurehead, because otherwise these Muslims around the world are going to feel...
I know the term Khalifa is often used as heads of kind of spiritual orders, maybe, or kind of subgroups and stuff. And
it wasn't that. There were debates in the Muslim world about whether or not people like the Sharif of Mecca should be the new Khalifa or somebody else, and that they would be given a bay'ah by the Muslims to be the Khalifa. But actually, their role would role would be purely spiritual, not political, almost like the Pope. Right?
Sorry to butt in again, but just a reminder: hit that subscribe button if you're into this kind of stuff, and if you're not, hit that dislike button twice. So going back to, just for the audience maybe to follow, and myself to follow.
And those were
clearly.
false debates, by the way. Those were,
What happened? What went wrong?
I mean, up till that point.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're talking about 100 years now post-abolition, and obviously different people, different readings of history, they'll put that date maybe 50, 100 years earlier or whatever, depending on...
So what happened on the 28th of Rajab, 1342, the 3rd of March, 1924, was the National Assembly in Ankara, which had been given the political power, which used to be in the hands of the Khalifa just a year beforehand, passed a resolution to formally abolish the Khilafah, to expel the Khalifa from what was then in Istanbul. He was in Istanbul, and to declare itself a republic where Islam basically had no place in the ruling system at all, which was something which was utterly alien to the Ottoman period. That's what happened on that day. That was the end point to a whole series of things. So anyone who looks at the tail end of the Ottoman period after World War I ended in 1918, and looks at the tail end of that, will see a whole series of events where power was going from the old ruling elite into this new group of people that had set themselves up in Ankara as nationalists and basically republicans. The last Sheikh al-Islam of the Ottoman Khilafah was called Sheikh Mustafa Sabri. May Allah have mercy on him. And he said the Khilafah was destroyed by the twin swords of atheism and nationalism. All right. What he had noticed, and it's actually very well documented now, is that in the preceding decades, there was a rise of secular thought and nationalistic thought, both amongst Turks, so there was Turkish nationalism, and amongst Arabs.
So by secular thought and nationalism, you're referring to the influence of Europe and Eurocentrist kind of philosophy and thinking.
Sheikh Taqiyuddin Mabhani, he wrote a book called Ad-Dawla Islamiyya, and it's a very short book, and it's a very easy book to read. If it has a weakness, the weakness is that it's not referenced. But I've found over recent years that when I read that bit, which talks about the demise of the Khilafah, it's very easy to find references for what he's saying on the web. So he describes how there's an influx of missionaries to the Khilafah from the United States and Europe in the kind of 1800s. Initially to places like Malta, but later on into Bilad al-Sham and Egypt. And some of the ones he's named, Eli Smith, Cornelius van Dyck, well documented, you can read about them, very famous Christian missionaries who came, learned Arabic, and started engaging a relationship with Christians within the Khilafah. Famous ones include people like Boutros Bustani and Nasif al-Zawaji, I think his name is. Okay, again, very easy to find their names and research who they are and what they did. And you can see this adoption of ideas which are based on Western Enlightenment thinking. They moved from a missionary sort of process to setting up cultural and educational establishments in the Khilafah. And some of those Arab Christians started promoting Arab nationalism. started promoting the idea that actually religion shouldn't have a part in governance, which is alien to the Ottoman tradition, absolutely. And similar things were happening in the Turkish-speaking areas of the Khilafah as well. So even in the time of, before Abdul Hamid, some of the brothers and sisters watching should read about the Khalifa Abdul Aziz, who was preceded Abdul Hamid. He was Abdul Hamid's uncle. Abdul Aziz was said to have committed suicide, all right? But it's widely believed that he was murdered. And if you read about the circumstances of his suicide, so-called suicide, it's a bizarre suicide. It's a kind of Dr. David Kelly type suicide. It's like, too many questions, okay? People in his governing council, his advisors, were pro-British, pro-secular ministers. You see photographs of them, long beards, Rumi topis, like all those kind of things, looking like classic Ottomans, but they had been affected by secular thought, and they were trying to drive the Khalifa down a road to more the same kind of language that we see in Europe adopted towards Turkey today. You need to modernize. You need to change.
That's precisely what it is. The European modernity creeping into the kind of Ottoman aristocracy and
the decline wasn't just in terms of these missionary invasions and these political shenanigans. These were there. There were two other elements which were there, which broke the camel's back. One was us as the ummah. The decline in Islamic thought in centuries was big. The time of the Ottomans did very great things, but they were not. One thing they were not was drawing upon the well of Islam and its aqidah and its ahkam and its solutions to human problems to solve their problems. They got to the state where they were trying to mimic what the West was doing, and so the decline in Islamic thought.
That's something that I don't know if it's a trope against them, or it's certainly something that I've heard and read, that the Ottomans didn't focus much on preserving and flourishing the intellectual tradition.
And there's many reasons for that.
Kind of military and power and economics and stuff.
There's many reasons for that. I mean, I'm not an Arab speaker, right? But actually, you only have to have some taste of the Arabic language to know that actually to really draw upon the wealth in the Sharia texts, it requires to have Arabic to be a strong. And the decline in Arabic had started way before, and the Ottomans were not an Arab-speaking society. The ulama were, but the majority of thinkers and people were not. And these things matter. The other thing that broke the camel's back were external things. So Abdul Hamid, may Allah have mercy on him, had to deal with a war in the Balkans and different secessionists trying to break away. And then ultimately you get, after his time, World War I. And World War I is a disaster. World War I, the Western powers thought that the Khilafah was going to be so weak that they'd win within a year. Right, they'd destroy the allies, Britain, France, Russia. They thought they'd destroy the Khilafah within a year. 3 years down the line, they were thinking about how do we make peace with the Ottoman state. Had it not been for the Americans intervening in World War I, the Khilafah may not have fallen. Had it not been for traitors within the Khilafah, like Sharif Hussein in Mecca, who spearheaded an Arab revolt, which meant the Ottomans had to fight on more than one front. And they were having to defend all kinds of areas which they should never have had to defend. They should never have had to defend Jerusalem, they should never have had to defend Mecca, Medina, Hijaz in the way they had to. And so lose Jerusalem, Damascus and Baghdad.
And also, there was on many fronts in terms of... I don't like blaming everything on kind of colonialism, but there was pressure in India, in British India, for fatwas to be given against the Ottomans and allegiance to be sworn to the colonizers and so forth. So there was pressure of all the frontiers kind of breaking away and kind of anti-Ottoman sentiment being fermented. My question is, do you think that the ummah got too big for the Ottomans to handle?
No, I don't think that that's the case, because actually, if you take, I mean, the Ottoman state at its peak was huge and manageable. Yeah, that was well ruled. There are good examples.
That's the thing with a peak, though, isn't it? It's followed by a trough.
Sure. But I don't think it's that. I think it is more. It is more that there is and Abdul Hamid, may Allah have mercy. And one of the reasons we always remember Abdul Hamid as a great Khalifa is that he actually tried very hard to try and re-establish some kind of order, and he did extraordinarily in terms of the circumstances that he faced internally and externally. But what happened in 1924 was a disaster, and it was an end point of a long process. And the other thing was,
so it wasn't like everything was fine and then
no, not at all. And people did see it.
Yeah.
And the other thing, Salman, is as Muslims, our nature is very trusting. We see things happening. Have you ever heard of? You must have heard of Ahmed Shawqi. Ahmed Shawqi is known as the Prince of Poetry in Egypt. Right? He's a very famous Arab poet in the early part of the 20th century. Shawqi wrote verse praising Mustafa Kemal. Praising Mustafa Kemal because he saw him as a great military leader who defeated the British at Gallipoli, who defeated the Greeks in the war against Greece, right? When Mustafa Kemal abolished the Khilafah, Shawqi was shocked. He was like, he was in trauma. He's written a verse which is one of the most famous eulogies to the Khilafah. Very moving. People who read it, they're in tears reading this. Okay. When he wrote it, Mustafa Sabri, the same last mufti of the Khilafah, said, now you're mourning it. Now you criticize Mustafa Kemal. But some of us could see this coming from before. Some of us could see the trajectory that the Young Turks and the nationalists and the secularists were going on. Others saw them as a means to an end. They thought, you know what, these guys are trying to regain some prestige and power to the Khilafah. Many pro-Islamic, pro-Caliphate people thought even the Young Turks were doing something good, or Mustafa Kemal was doing something good, until they saw the final knife being stabbed in, and then they realized the magnitude of what had happened in retrospect. And Muslims can be very trusting and make excuses for people when perhaps they ought to be looking at much more scrutiny. And if we're talking about Khilafah and ruling, you know, the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's a Nabi of Allah, he's a Rasul Allah. His status amongst his companions was, I think, couldn't even look him in the eyes, some of them. So overawed with respect for him they were. Yet there are examples where they questioned him. And they asked him why he's doing something and why he's not doing something else. Right? Even with him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as their political leader and prophet, they're willing to ask him questions, they're willing to scrutinize, and more so with the Khulafa'i Rashidun, right? So when Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was about to send armies in all directions, people were questioning him. Why do this? Why not do this? And Umar radiallahu anhu is the Khalifa. People are asking him, why are you fixing the mahar for women? Why are you, they're questioning him. Accountability is something that works two ways. We as a ummah need to be accounting our leaders. And the leaders, anyone in any position of leadership, needs to be willing to be questioned, scrutinized, and accounted. That culture is gone. That culture, either we're too deferential to our leaders, or we're too merciful, if you like. We make too many excuses for brothers that we respect, and we don't give nasiha an account. Yes? Or we put ourselves in a position of authority and we can't take criticism. We can't take scrutiny. And that culture needs to exist within Muslims, definitely.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it was part of Jahangir's report for the Ayan Institute on, reviving building a new civilization of Islam. he mentioned something that shocked me in terms of the actual numbers, right? So you're saying something like the population of Pakistan now is bigger than the entire Ottoman,
Yeah.
Caliphate, because just human populations, they kind of shot up
exponential, yes.
in 20th century. So this is a question, kind of elephant in the room anytime there's a discussion about Khilafah historically, and that is, what would it look like today? What could a Khilafah look like tomorrow in the future? Because we recognize the whole continuum between do exactly everything as historically someone did versus they didn't drink Pepsi, they didn't drive cars, and they worked in camels and stuff. And ultimately everyone's going to have a different kind of, every group or ijtihad is going to have a different line that they've drawn, different masail and issues. What's your view about what a Khilafah would look like in the age of 10 billion human beings on earth, maybe 2 billion plus Muslims? That's a lot of people to govern.
Yeah. So thought on this matter starts with the ideal, and the ideal is made up of the absolute pillars and red lines, which may be of a few, and the sunan, because we draw our example from the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said to us to take his sunnah and the sunnah of the Khulafa Rashidun as examples for us. So some of those will be part of the red lines and pillars, the wajibat, and some of those will be great examples for us to follow, right? And then mapping that on the world we live in today is what you're talking about, really, isn't it? It's because how you map that on.
Because you know what you said before about, look, pragmatically, it's impossible for one person to, directly
govern
reach
without assistance, without governors, without delegating authority. Yes,
but that's not the case now, is it? I mean, theoretically speaking, you can build some kind of electronic surveillance system or automated system where every citizen of the Caliphate can actually directly, send a message to the Khalifa or say, I think we should do this, or I disagree with you on that.
But Khilafah is not YouGov. It's government. It's not YouGov, right? Its job is to look after people's affairs. Its job is to implement the necessary rulings of Islam. One man can't look after the affairs of leadership. Is unitary, right? But actually the administration of that has to be, by definition, has to be delegated either by task, like Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam used to do to people. Has to be either like Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did with his close companions in Mecca, or geographically by governors. Okay, so that has to happen. So what a Khilafah would look like in the world today is you will have a capital and you will have wilayat, you will have provinces, right? And some of the matters would be looked after necessarily would be in the directly managed by the Khalifa. Others would be delegated, but the responsibility stops with the Khalifa. So if he just lets somebody get on with it and doing it badly, that's no good. He has to be pursuing what's happening in different places and looking and scrutinizing how well are people being governed. Accountability, I can only describe what is our model, if you like, based on these things. So in our model, we would have, like we say, provinces, governorships. Accounting the Khalifa centrally would be a ruling council of, not ruling council, a Shura council, Majlis al-Ummah, where people are elected to it, all right? And their job would be to...
From each country or each region, you're saying?
Could be from each region, yes. It should be...
like an EU kind of thing?
It should be, and within each region, you should be electing the Ahlul Hal wal Aqd to account the Wali, right? And accountability shouldn't just be down to these people. Accountability, there should be political parties in the ummah that is accounting the ruler. The ulama should be scrutinizing and counting them. The media, the media should be part of that independence that is accounting and scrutinizing politicians,
Yeah.
right? Not tabloid tittle-tattle, not Harry and Meghan, yes, not rubbish like that.
Speaking of Harry and Meghan, just kidding.
No, but it's a joke.
not a tangent I don't
It's a
wanna
joke.
go on.
You know when they talk about a free media in the West, right? A free media is what sells papers. Harry and Meghan sells papers, but looking at the failure of the government to provide PPE and test and trace in looking after the affairs of its citizens doesn't sell papers, right? One is about the personal lives of people, which really has no place in the public eye. The other is about government accountability, and media should be scrutinizing that. So should it be in the Khilafah. And the other thing which is very important in any model that we have is, remember, in Khilafah, judiciary is independent of the executive.
The ulama.
The ulama, the judges, and the judges have, bay'ah is a contract, right? The ruler agrees to rule by kitab and sunnah, most beautifully expressed by Sayyidina Abu Bakr when he said, obey me as long as I obey Allah and His Messenger, and if I disobey Allah and His Messenger, you have no obedience to me, okay? And the ones who are ruled have to accept that person as their ruler, as their government, look and obey the laws of the land based on Sharia. But if there's a conflict between them, the judiciary can come in, and if the Khalifa has broken his bay'ah contract, yes, he can be removed. He can be removed. There's no, and that's how our system should work. And if the Majlis al-Ummah in a local district, in a local wilaya, have a vote of no confidence in their wali, the Khalifa, if he's following the sunnah of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he will change that wali, won't he? Because he's lost the authority. By definition, that's how it should work.
The thing is that I'm thinking of is, I mean, today that is completely understandable, and you'd assume, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, that would be probably quite straightforward to actually achieve. But now, with the rise of the digital age, with the rise of, you can manipulate a people's mind and turn them against a perfectly good, governor. Or
so you've identified one modern phenomenon, which is the propaganda,
or highly sophisticated, targeted, automated, almost propaganda.
And propaganda existed. I mean, propaganda. You don't think that pamphlets that were being given out in the Ottoman days, which were rallying public opinion against the Khalifa.
Well, it worked.
It worked, didn't it? Yes. So you're absolutely right. The digital age has changed. So data security is something. In fact, our but that's a challenge for all countries in the world today. And perhaps strangely, I mean, the more your information systems are developed, the more of an Achilles heel you potentially have, right? And the more,
I think Estonia is like a world leader in terms of everything is on the cloud for them.
Yeah, but I mean,
in government.
Strangely enough, in some parts of our Muslim world, we are behind on some of these things. So we perhaps have less than an Achilles heel, but. You're 100% right.
But if you see where power is, for example,
data security is something that has to be part of your security thinking in any modern day and age. Any polity, any state, any dawla Islamiyya in the future has to be thinking about its, and that goes from everything from making your information systems secure. Your most modern day weapon systems are based on software. So, US is not so scared of China's tanks and planes as it is of its ability to crash its software.
Absolutely.
So those are all elements of
the reason why I ask is because this is a question I put to Jahangir as well about looking at a new civilization of Islam and what the future is. I'm always wondering, are we in trying to imagine a kind of rectifying the situation of the ummah, are we kind of setting ourselves up for building something that by the time we get there is going to be out of date, right? So for example, today when we're looking at where does power lies governments, nation states, national assemblies, parliaments, all that kind of stuff. But like Apple, Google, Amazon, they're probably more powerful than many countries.
They are powerful in the sense that they have enormous volumes of data, and that
data, money, control over
influence.
people's lives, potentially.
But hasn't it to some extent? I mean, if we were backtracking 100 years, and I said to you, well, Rothschild or a Rockefeller or all the big merchant banks in the even the Goldman Sachses of this world, and these kind of people existed in some shape or form. So money, and actually they were the ones that loaned money to states to allow them to fight wars. Okay, the East India Company was even a private company at one stage, wasn't it? So it's a fighting its own wars. So what you've got is a reality that exists in the world, which is that actually, and in the capitalist world particularly, that these things like governments and parliaments and senates and Congress are actually the ones with the real power. No, and even
that's what I'm saying.
Even with the data security thing,
something.
even with the data security thing, if you look at the threat to the United States in terms of its elections, or in terms of Britain with its Brexit vote and stuff, it's states like Russia that people are questioning whether they manipulated the outcome of these things. So these are real questions, okay, and I
think it requires us to rethink, that
why
because
rethink? Surely,
I mean, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it would be a very sensible thing to say, you know what, we need to build a in terms of country, just ignore the impact of the manipulation of human beings via sophisticated digital electronic means. Let me just finish the point. But if you look, say in 20 years' time, it's very imaginable actually that Amazon, for example, is doing all of the things that a government would normally do. So, historically, governments would be in charge of A, B, C, but now imagine, your fridge is alerting you to or sending data, or because this whole thing of this new world order of, or some people call surveillance capitalism, it's based on the predictability of future human action. And if our agency, our personal sovereignty is being removed, then we need to. I'm not saying I have the answer, but we need to have that on the radar, such not just from a security point of view, but where are maybe the Muslim versions of,
so hang on,
for example,
not just from a security
computers.
Point of view. In the end, these are.
It's not security in terms of Amazon, and probably a bunch of companies do the same. They can predict your future behavior to such an extent where the notion of your own personal decision making goes out the window. So
look,
right?
Let's
that's control over people's life. They can subtly and electronically, you've
made your point very eloquently. Now, can I take over as host of the show? So let's break this down a little bit, because you've mashed loads of stuff into one rant. You've mashed loads of stuff. So the first element is, it is security. There is a security element, right? There is a security element. So any state, Khilafah or China or Russia or Britain or the United States, doesn't just have to think of a cyberbug crashing its health IT systems or its air traffic network. All states have to think about that, or its military software. They also
companies.
They also have to think about how their politics of their country could be manipulated by this data. The markets in their company could be manipulated by this data. Opinions can be manipulated by this data. And this is something they are all learning. So in China today, there is looking at like, do the Chinese really want their, 1.5 billion plus citizens or 1.5 billion citizens to be using Google and WhatsApp and all these things, right, which are collecting their data and potentially going to be used against their population.
That's why they have their own versions.
That's because they have their own versions. So what this tells you about is, for us as Muslims generally, and Khilafah in particular, or anyone in particular, is actually being self-reliant. When I say independent, I don't mean independent in the sense that you're going to cut yourself off from the world. Yeah? You're not going to be a North Korea. But you have to be... What China's showing is that they can't rely on being networked into... and rely on the networks, which are either run by the US or run by US-based corporations. Yeah? That mentality...
And in fact, the corporations that run the US. So even when we say state now or governments have very little power in the face of... these huge corporations now.
When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, وَلَنْ يَجَلَ اللَّهُ لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ السَّبِيلَ, that Allah doesn't allow that the disbelievers have a way over the believers. It makes it incumbent on us that whether it's being self-reliant within the ummah on military technology or communication network or trade or medicine, I shouldn't have to rely, in the Khilafah, I shouldn't have to rely. Something like COVID, I should work with the rest of the world on finding a cure, finding a vaccine. But I should never rely on the US or Europe or China to giving my data away or giving on that. So a fundamental concept for Muslims to adopt is that where are our states going in terms of self-reliance? Okay? Where? And rather... That doesn't happen, except in a few places. So, you look at Pakistan and its historical conflict with India. It's forced Pakistan. It does buy huge amounts of military hardware from other countries, but it has started to try and develop some of its own artillery and aircraft and tanks and stuff. Missiles. It started to try and do it itself. And honestly speaking, a second-rate something that you've built yourself, which is a step on the road to being independent and self-reliant in any way, whether it's the technology aspects you're talking about or other things, is unquestionably necessary. Unquestionably. And again, that level of scrutiny, if you look, when people criticize, when we as Hizb ut-Tahrir criticize governments in the Muslim world for being lackeys, right? It's not just that they're not all like, the Gulf states where they're literally almost like told what to do. They're also ones
soft power.
Yeah, they're also those who think they're doing a good thing, but by embedding their systems in the current existing order, you're actually tying your own hand without realizing it. Simple matter of currency. Look, most currencies in the Muslim world will be pegged to the dollar. Anything happens to the dollar, you're going to fear that your own currency is going down. You have effectively enslaved yourself to...
Or even, like what China's doing now all across the Muslim world, giving loans, and then when they default, we'll own your utilities or your infrastructure or these bridges or these roads and that kind of stuff.
And so this point,
and the same is for data.
There's a poverty of vision, like Pakistan, Afghanistan. Like there's a lot of talk about, and we've already seen the oil sucked dry out of the Middle East. The biggest oil-producing part of the world is in the Muslim world. Okay, there's a lot of discussion about where fuel security is going in the future, whether or not it's going away from fossil fuels.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why.
But technology. Tablets, phones, other things rely on lithium, nickel. These are in abundance in some parts of the Muslim world. China has its eye on Pakistan, Afghanistan, because it's very mineral rich, these parts of the world. And they need these minerals for this kind of technology going forward. We don't have a vision, a political vision in the Muslim world of how we would utilize these, because in origin these things are the ummahs. They aren't private companies. They belong. That wealth from that is part of the wealth that is circulated amongst the ummah to solve problems, build hospitals, build roads. Right? It's not just zakat that we are expected to utilize.
That's a good answer. You make a good host. Good challenge. But
if you've been watching Salman's adverts, don't give him any money.
We accept other gifts as well. Final reminder, brothers and sisters, I promise. A lot of you have graciously asked how we can support Islam 20C. How you can support is by clicking this button and donating £5 a month, inshallah. The thing many people, also we put a kind of question out on our social media and many people responded. We asked, how can Muslims unite globally today? Right? There were many interesting answers, many thought-provoking things as well. And one thing that kept coming up again and again and again is, how do we actually foster the ability to unite despite differences? People are giving examples. Okay, look at Syria, for example, when the revolution was kind of gaining momentum. And not just Syria, it's unfair to Afghanistan, Iraq, anywhere there's destabilization, anywhere there's some kind of smaller groups, Libya, they're coming together, they're making some alliances, but then they start infighting, right? Wherever the causes are, external, internal, whatever, we seem to almost automatically, when two Muslims get together, whether it's your local mosque, committee members, election, someone gets into, when power kind of gets to our head, we tend to start infighting, and we can't seem to hold even kind of quote unquote Islamic groups, overtly, Islamic in their messaging and so forth. We can't seem to remain in power without kind of starting aiming our guns at each other, right? How do we address this? Because practically, imagine Hizb ut-Tahrir or whoever, they make all of the things you mentioned, they make all that infrastructure. I can just see at the Muslims at our current level, as we treat each other, as we act towards each other, especially online, which is like the new world now, which is moving more and more online, especially with the pandemic. Everyone's online now, and cyberspace is like more populated than real life sometimes. How do we stop us? Well, how do we continue with power without it kind of leading to us just breaking up and?
I'm just opening this because I want. There's a lovely quote I got, which I. So there is a. This is something that all Muslims would agree with, right? There is an aspect of us as individuals, of how we rectify ourselves, isn't there? There's an aspect of that. So understanding the importance of responsibility and leadership, and that you'll be accounted on Yawm al-Qiyamah for this, that you'll be. And also, like we talked before about the followers, both obeying and accounting, right? And those two things are not mutually conflicted. And that rectification of ourselves has to acknowledge that we are corrupted. It's not just that we lack certain Islamic concepts. We are corrupted by the dominant thoughts in the world, which come from secularism, capitalism. So individualism is rife, isn't it? I mean, why is it that in the Far East they were very cooperative about dealing with the pandemic rules, whereas here we've got people that refuse to stay at home, refuse to put on masks. In the States, people are like rebelling against it almost, yeah? Why? It's because they've been taught, and we've been taught from a very young age, that you are the most important thing, not the collective. Yes, not obeying Allah,
the false idol of the self.
Yeah, and not obeying the one that Allah has legitimately given authority to, or that Islam legitimately gives authority to in any given situation. I don't mean spiritual authority. I mean the ruling, the leadership authority in any given situation. Okay, and that could be in a house, the relationship between man, wife, children, parents. It could be in the mosque. It could be in the community. So this rectification of the self requires certain Islamic concepts and a recognition that we are corrupted in the dominant thoughts. But, think of when Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam went to Al-Madinah. He went to a place, Yathrib, which was torn up by war and conflict before. Tribes were fighting each other, hating each other, killing each other. Yeah, and at some point, those people, they embraced Islam, right? But they accepted they would bring this man and what he brought, Islam, as the arbiter between them. Okay? And when he came to Medina, the Sahifa of Medina became the document arbitering between them. And actually, even then, when the best ruler of the best of creation came with that best constitution, there were people that undermined it in his state. The tribes, Banu Nadir, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Qurayza, the Munafiqeen, yeah, they were all undermining it from day one, right? And how did he deal with them? When they undermined it, there was a legal sanction on them, depending on what they did, right? But he didn't like start spying on people to see who were the munafiqeen. He didn't start like oppressing people. Rather, he dealt with case by case on what was apparent, didn't he? There's a statement by Umayr ibn Sa'd, radiyallahu anhu, who was the wali of Homs at the time of Umar ibn Khattab. He said, Islam will remain strong as long as the authority is strong. And the strength of authority doesn't come from the killing by the sword and the lashing by the whip. It comes by judging with the truth and upholding of justice. Umar radiallahu anhu, he said he wished he had a man like Umayr bin Sa'd as one of his, helping him look after the Muslims' affairs. I think, when I think of some of the big schisms in the Muslim world, Shia Sunni, in countries like Pakistan, the Balochi separatists, in places like Turkey, the Kurdish separatists, a lot of this comes from a sense of people feeling they've been hard done by, injustice, neglected, yes, persecuted, right? And sometimes they have been. And so there needs to not just be an Islamic constitution. There needs to be an enforcing of justice, upholding of truth, even if it's against your own clan or ethnic background or sect or party, if it meant that you're upholding justice for the one who came genuinely aggrieved. So those stories that we tell our children about when the non-Muslim, the Jewish man came over a dispute with Sayyidina Ali when he was Khalifa, and the judge arbitrated in favor of the plaintiff, not the Khalifa. They have a meaning, don't they, in terms of what we learn from the Khulafa Rashidun. That actually, this is the manifest way that actually you can start, and I say start, to build that trust. In the history of this,
instilling a sense of justice into our children.
Instilling a sense, no. That's right, but that's part of the rectification of the self. But ultimately, what it means is that when you come, whoever, and Allah knows whoever comes to assume and is given bay'ah as the next Khalifa. And by the way, the long tradition in Musnad Ahmad that talks about the foretelling of that, talks about Khilafah ala minhaj al-nubuwah is the next Khilafah, not a corrupted Khilafah, but a Khilafah that actually adopts these principles of prophethood, right? So whoever comes, who's given bay'ah as the next Khalifa, has to rule in a way that brings these people together. And you may be somebody who comes from a community or a background that thinks that you are hard done by, or you may be from a political grouping in the society that has been, you might be a communist, for example, that has been calling for communism in your state or whatever, yeah? But now the line is drawn clear. Sorry, I'm knocking your microphone. The line we've drawn clear. We clean, the slate is wiped clean, right? You are now going to be accounted, and we as the government are now going to be accounted on this way of ruling. If people start to see that actually being realized, that trust builds. And bear in mind, in the history of Islam, why is it that even non-Muslims felt loyal to the Khilafah when the Crusaders came, for example? Why? Because they recognized that even that Islamic rule gave them their rights. Okay? And I don't say that's easy, but that's the way we have to start thinking. And I think it's right to look at these schisms that exist. It's also right when people talk about rectification of self, if they recognize that we are corrupted by many ideas from outside and from the dominant secular thought. But more than that, it's when it comes to the issue of ruling, and if, for example, Salman, you get appointed as a mosque committee chairman, I would expect you to adopt these if you want to succeed as a legitimate chairman of the mosque committee. You would try and uphold these principles. You would not say, "Oh, you're my friend, you can come and have your circle," and say to the other one that you don't like the way that he speaks, that he can't. No, you will play fair with everyone, and if you would expect them to account you from day one. You'd want that. Like
it's important for, I wrote about this a few years ago called the Caliphate chicken and the egg. In terms, a lot of people when they're talking about what went wrong, depending on your own particular interests and maybe background or even personality type, we tend to focus sometimes more on macro level issues, sometimes systems and so forth, and sometimes on micro level issues. Some people, in terms of fixing people and their personal integrity and so forth. And it's deeply fallacious to only focus on one. You do need both of that. If you have the system set up very nicely and people are selfish and corrupt or obnoxious or don't have the akhlaq of the Muslims, the Prophet ﷺ that he came to perfect, then the best system is gonna be undermined and broken and from within. But if you have a bad system and you focus on making people harder workers, making people more efficient in their job and more polite and more cooperative and more effective human beings, you're just going to increase the output of evil happening.
So Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he had the best system, the divine system, and he had a society of the best generation, but he also had some really bad eggs in there, and they were really, really trying to create fitna for him and really trying to undermine the society, and yet somehow he managed to hold all of that together, and that's
I think he mastered Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam both spheres,
of course,
the systemic,
of course,
the macro, and also
of
the
course,
micro individual.
But when we're talking about political, it's like you say, all these things that we need to do ourselves. If you do all of that, but if you don't have that glue,
the issue is people shouldn't undermine the other. That's the issue.
If there's
because we need people to focus on the macro issues. We need people simultaneously to focus on, whatever people, is easy for them and so forth. But we need to recognize, like I read one thing that I forgot the name of the sheikh. He mentioned the ummah is like the hadith. My ummah is like a body, one body. The feet don't do the same job as the hands. The eyes don't do the same job as the brain, for example. So likewise, we need to recognize that those who are working on raising the youth, for example, or working on increasing the personal integrity angle of and the spirituality and so forth of human beings, and those who are need to work on the global systemic issues, there's no problem having a focus as long as it's not mutually undermining and saying my way is the only way, because focusing only on macro is going to lead to disaster, in my opinion.
Islam is not just micro or macro. I don't classify it like that. Rather, actually, you can say there are elements of Islam which are thoughts, ideas, rules. They exist in the personal domain or the communal domain in terms of families, communities, and stuff. And then What we've been talking about predominantly today is there's elements of Islam which were the method to implement the Sharia rules, protect them and propagate them, right? And that required a legitimate Islamic authority in the end. This 100 years is marking the end of that. Even when that is restored, what we talk about in terms of the personal domain, what you might call the micro, that has to exist. Rather, I would argue that it can better be achieved when you have a government and a society that allows that to flourish. That's not to say it should not even be worked on now. It should.
And it's a prerequisite.
It should. Yeah,
well.
It's a prerequisite for those who even who aspire to even try and carry the noble cause without question. It's a prerequisite for the ordinary Muslim amongst us who wants to achieve Jannah and wants to try and please Allah, right? But I'd say that the only thing I think the thing I agree with you is when there should be no contradiction and conflict between people, except if you start saying, no, you're doing this is actually driving people away from what they should be doing. It can't be. If we view Islam as a complete way of life, you can't say you're calling for the political.
Shouldn't undermine other legitimate causes.
And everything in Sharia has its priority. What we're talking about today, what we're talking about on this anniversary, which people don't really talk about, do they, very much? Let's face it. I mean, we talk about it all the time in Hizb ut-Tahrir, but really...
Really?
But when you really, when you look at the status of this issue and how much other people try to even just educate people on this matter and the relevance of this matter and the importance of this matter, it is actually very small, very small. And if you even look at the discourse of Muslim activists in this week about Harry and Meghan versus this, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy, and I think so. I do agree with you that we should not be attacking each other, and different people have different focuses. Yes, I would hope if somebody who sees their focus on improving tarbiyah and the akhlaq came to me and said, "You're working for Khilafah, you should improve yourself." I would say, "Jazakallah khair." I should and I must, right? By the same token, if I go to somebody who is working for that and I say, "Mashallah, you're doing this, but you know what? You should be addressing these issues as well and working for it." I hope they wouldn't turn around and, say, "No, that's not my job." Yeah? Do you see what I mean? It's like, and yet, actually, I would argue with you, more people will come around that way around.
Yeah.
But the benefit of this discussion for all people watching is that actually your point is valid. Islam is Islam. Fard is fard. Wajib is wajib. Obligation is obligation. Whether it's the weighty, huge geopolitical issues of having a Khalifa and who is the voice of Islam in the world and who carries this message to humanity, or whether it's my mother advising me on how I should, eat with my right hand or say Bismillah before I eat and not waste any of my food.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair. On the topic of food, I heard this place is quite popular on the map. And we've taken a lot of your time. So Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Abdul Wahid. Pleasure
Salman.
to speak to you again. You're working towards Khilafah, but you know what? I advise you should subscribe to Soundcloud's YouTube channel and click like and share. You too at home, wherever you're watching this. Remember to donate as well if you can to help support this podcast.
Give him any money.
Don't give me any money, but click on this link here and one khumas will go towards H. Just kidding. Jazakallah khair again for your viewership. If you managed to make it to the end of this podcast, if you like this podcast, give a like and a share. Remember to get involved in the comments below. Let us know what you think. Agree, disagree, have any good points, or have a read. And continue watching Islam Trinity, watching Unscripted for more juicy stuff like this. Until next time, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Unscripted.